Late October, 1979. The rain came down in sheets that night. Thick, cold, relentless. The kind of rain that turned dirt roads into rivers of mud and made the forest seem infinite, swallowing sound and light alike. In the northwestern corner of Idaho, where the Bitterroot Mountains cut jagged silhouettes against storm-heavy skies, the Clearwater Ridge Wilderness Station stood like a forgotten outpost at the edge of civilization. It was a place people avoided. Not because of danger, at least not the kind you could name, but because of the silence. The oppressive, suffocating silence that pressed down on your chest when you stood among those ancient pines, their branches creaking in winds that seemed to whisper secrets no one wanted to hear. By 1979, America was tired. Tired from Vietnam, from Watergate, from oil embargoes and hostages in Iran. The national exhaustion had seeped into places like Clearwater Ridge, where isolation felt less like solitude and more like abandonment. The ranger station, built in 1947 with timber from the surrounding forest, had seen better days. Paint peeled from the window frames. The radio equipment was outdated. Budget cuts meant fewer patrols, longer shifts, and questions no one bothered to answer anymore. The 5 rangers assigned to Clearwater Ridge that October were supposed to be the last rotation of the season. After them, the station would close for winter, locked and silent until spring thaw. They knew each other well, some better than others, and they'd worked together through the long, uneventful summer. But October changed things. October always did. James Holloway was the senior ranger, 43 years old, with the kind of face that looked carved from the mountains themselves, weathered, lined, hard. He'd been with the Forest Service for 21 years, ever since coming back from Korea with a Purple Heart and nightmares he never talked about. Tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair he kept military short, James had a way of moving through the forest that was almost reverent. He knew every trail, every creek, every cave. The other rangers said he could read the woods like other men read newspapers. He wore the same green flannel shirt under his ranger jacket every day, frayed at the cuffs, and he had a habit of touching the small silver compass that hung from his belt loop, a nervous tic he'd developed over the years. James didn't smile much anymore, but when he did, it never quite reached his eyes. Patricia Trish Chen was 29, the only woman on the team, and the smartest person in any room she walked into. She'd grown up in San Francisco, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who'd wanted her to be a doctor or lawyer, anything respectable. Instead, she'd gotten a degree in forestry from Berkeley and headed for the most remote posting she could find. Trish was small, barely 5'3", with straight black hair she kept in a practical braid and wire-rimmed glasses that were always smudged with fingerprints. She had a sharp wit and sharper eyes, noticing details others missed. A broken branch, a disturbed patch of earth, the way animal tracks suddenly stopped as if something had simply vanished. She collected rocks and kept them in labeled jars in her room at the station, each one catalogued with meticulous notes. The others teased her about it, but Trish didn't mind. She preferred rocks to people most days. Rocks didn't lie. Marcus Webb was 35, ex-Army like James, but Vietnam had been his war. He'd served 2 tours as a medic and came back with skills that made him invaluable in the wilderness. How to set bones, treat snake bites, keep someone alive when the nearest hospital was 3 hours away on good roads. Marcus was lean and wiry, with dark skin and darker eyes that seemed permanently troubled, as if he was always seeing something just beyond the present moment. He had a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his hairline, a souvenir from Khe Sanh that he never explained. Marcus was quiet, almost unnaturally so, and he had a habit of humming old Motown songs under his breath when he worked. He chain-smoked Marlboros, lighting each new cigarette from the ember of the last, and his fingers were stained yellow-brown from years of the habit. Sometimes, late at night, the others could hear him pacing in his room, footsteps creaking on old floorboards, talking to people who weren't there. David Kowalski was the youngest at 24, fresh out of forestry school, and still carrying the eager energy of someone who believed in things. He was stocky and strong, with unruly red hair and a spray of freckles across his nose that made him look even younger than he was. David had grown up in rural Montana, the son of a logger, and he knew his way around an axe and chainsaw better than anyone. He was friendly, sometimes too friendly, always trying to lighten the mood with jokes that didn't quite land. David wore a St. Christopher medal his grandmother had given him, and he never took it off, not even to shower. He'd been dating a girl named Sarah back in Missoula, and he carried her picture in his wallet, showing it to anyone who'd look. He planned to propose at Christmas. He'd already bought the ring. Robert Bobby Garrett was 31, and something about him had always been slightly off. He'd transferred to Clearwater Ridge 2 years earlier from a station in Oregon, and rumors followed him like shadows. Some said he'd been forced to transfer after an incident with a hiker, something about aggressive behavior, accusations that were never quite proven. Bobby was tall and thin, almost gaunt, with pale skin and colorless eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He had a nervous laugh that came at inappropriate moments, and he collected knives. Folding knives, fixed-blade knives, hunting knives, keeping them sharp enough to split hairs. Bobby was good at his job, maybe too good, knowing the forest in a way that felt less like familiarity and more like obsession. He'd disappear on solo patrols for days, coming back with mud under his fingernails and stories that didn't quite add up. The others didn't trust him, not really, but in a place as remote as Clearwater Ridge, you learned to work with what you had. The trouble started 3 weeks before they disappeared. It was David who found it first, the camp. He'd been doing a routine patrol along the northern boundary, checking for illegal hunting activity, when he'd stumbled across a clearing about 8 miles from the station. Someone had been there recently. A fire pit, still warm. Empty tin cans scattered around, but no tent, no sleeping bag, no gear of any kind. Just the fire and the cans and something else, marks on the trees. Strange marks, carved deep into the bark of 6 pines that circled the clearing. They weren't words exactly, but they weren't random scratches either. Symbols maybe. Deliberate patterns that made David's skin crawl when he looked at them too long. He'd taken photographs with his Polaroid camera, the kind of documentation they were supposed to do for anything unusual. But when he'd brought the photos back to show the others, they'd come out wrong. Blurred and overexposed, even though he'd used the right settings. Only one image was clear enough to see, and what it showed made Trish go quiet for a long time. "That's not from any indigenous tribe in this region," she'd said finally, adjusting her glasses as she studied the photo. "And it's not hobo signs or logger marks either. I don't know what it is." James had taken the photo, held it up to the light, and his jaw had tightened. How fresh were those carvings? "Fresh," David had replied. "Maybe a day, maybe less." The sap was still sticky. Marcus had been smoking by the window, and he'd turned slowly, exhaling blue smoke. 8 miles north, he'd said quietly. "That's near the old survey boundary, the one they stopped using." "Why'd they stop using it?" David had asked. No one had answered, because everyone at Clearwater Ridge knew why, even if they didn't talk about it. The northern sector had a reputation. 3 hikers had gone missing there in the early 70s, never found. A trapper had reported strange lights in 76. And there were older stories, too, from before the station was even built. Nez Perce legends about a place in those mountains where the earth was sick, where animals wouldn't go and the trees grew twisted. Superstition, James had called it. Just superstition. But he'd ordered patrols to stay south of the boundary after that. Then the radio calls started. Short bursts of static, always between 2 and 3 a.m. Voices that might have been voices, or might have been interference, garbled, distorted, speaking in rhythms that sounded almost like words but weren't. At first they'd assumed it was atmospheric conditions, solar flares, something technical. But the calls came every night for a week, and they always came at the same time. Trish had tried to record them on her cassette player, but the tapes would come out blank. Just a faint hissing, like wind through cracks in a wall. Bobby had laughed about it. that nervous laugh that set everyone on edge. Probably just some kids with a CB radio messing with us. Kids don't hike 8 miles into wilderness in October, Marcus had said flatly. Not at 2 in the morning. The atmosphere at the station changed. Small things that wouldn't have mattered before suddenly did. Supplies going missing, a box of batteries, a coil of rope, 3 days' worth of rations. David's compass spinning wildly whenever he walked near the northern sector. The way the forest had gone quiet. No birds, no squirrels. Just the endless whisper of wind in branches. On October 28, 1979, James had called a meeting in the station's main room. Rain hammered against the windows, and the lights flickered with brownouts that were becoming more frequent. The 5 rangers sat around the old wooden table, coffee growing cold in chipped mugs. "We're shutting down early," James had announced. "I've radioed headquarters. They're sending a truck on the 31st to close up the station. We're done." Relief had flickered across David's face. Trish had nodded slowly. Marcus had just lit another cigarette. But Bobby had leaned forward, those colorless eyes reflecting lamplight. "What about the camp? Don't we need to investigate?" "It's not our problem anymore," James had said. "Let the county handle it in spring." "But what if someone's out there? What if they're in trouble?" James had looked at Bobby for a long moment. "Then they've been in trouble for 3 weeks, and 3 more days won't matter." That should have been the end of it. They should have packed up, locked the doors, and driven away on October 31st when the truck arrived. They should have gone home to their lives. James to his empty house in Boise, Trish to her parents in San Francisco, Marcus to wherever men like Marcus went, David to Sarah and that ring in his pocket, Bobby to whatever darkness was eating him from the inside. But October 29th changed everything, because that was the day they found the hatch. It was Bobby who found it, or so he claimed. He'd been doing a final patrol, checking the southern fire roads, when he'd noticed something off the old logging trail, a depression in the earth, too regular to be natural, covered with decades of fallen leaves and moss. He'd cleared the debris and found it, a metal hatch, rusted but intact, with a handle and a lock that looked military surplus, maybe 30 years old. When he'd radioed back to the station, his voice had carried an excitement that bordered on mania. "You need to see this," he'd said. "All of you. Right now." They'd driven out in the station's 2 trucks, following Bobby's coordinates to a part of the forest none of them knew well, a dense section of old-growth pine where the canopy blocked out most of the daylight, and the ground was carpeted with needles soft as felt. The hatch was exactly where Bobby had said it would be, half buried, waiting. James had knelt beside it, running his fingers over the cold metal. "This is government," he'd said quietly. "Cold War era, probably. There were rumors of fallout shelters built in remote areas, bunkers for VIPs if the bombs dropped. Should we open it?" David had asked, and even he had sounded uncertain. "No," Trish had said immediately. "We should report it and let the proper authorities handle it." But Marcus had already grabbed the handle. Might be someone inside, someone hurt. The lock was rusted through. It broke with a single hard pull. And when they'd lifted the hatch, a smell had rolled out. Stale air, damp earth, and underneath it all, something else. Something chemical and wrong that made their eyes water. A ladder descended into darkness. Bobby had clicked on his flashlight, played the beam down into the void. Metal rungs, concrete walls, shadows that seemed to move in the shifting light. "We should go down," Bobby had said, and his voice had been strange, eager. "We should see what's down there." That was when Trish had noticed the marks on the inside of the hatch, scratches, deep and frantic, as if someone had tried to claw their way out from below. And in the beam of Bobby's flashlight, she'd seen something else. Footprints in the dust at the bottom of the ladder. Fresh footprints. Recent. Someone had been down there. Maybe someone still was. James had made the decision. "We're going back to the station. We're radioing this in." "We're not going down there without proper equipment and authorization." They'd closed the hatch, marked the location with flagging tape, and driven back through the darkening forest. No one had spoken much. The smell from the bunker seemed to cling to their clothes, their skin, their thoughts. That night, October 29, 1979, was the last night anyone saw the 5 Rangers alive. The radio logs would later show that James made contact with headquarters at 9:47 p.m., reporting the discovery of what they believed to be an abandoned Cold War bunker. The dispatcher had told them to secure the area and wait for a specialized team to arrive on November 1st. James had acknowledged, signed off, and that was the last official communication from Clearwater Ridge Wilderness Station. The truck arrived on October 31st as scheduled, just after dawn. The driver found the station empty. Doors unlocked, lights on, coffee still warm in the pot. The Rangers' personal belongings were still in their rooms: wallets, keys, photographs. David's St. Christopher medal lay on his bunk. Trish's rock collection sat undisturbed on her shelf. Marcus's cigarettes were scattered on the table, as if he'd left in the middle of smoking one. But the Rangers themselves were gone. Both station trucks were parked outside. No signs of struggle, no blood, no notes. Just 5 people who had vanished like smoke, leaving behind a forest that had grown quieter than ever, and questions that would echo for 20 years. And in the northern sector, 8 miles from the station, 6 pines still bore strange symbols carved deep into their bark, while beneath the earth, behind a rusted hatch, no one would think to open for 2 decades. Something waited in the dark. The truth was down there. It had been down there all along. But truth has a way of staying buried, until someone is desperate enough, or foolish enough, to dig. November 1979, October 1999. The search for the 5 missing Rangers began on November 1st, 1979, and it would become one of the most extensive wilderness searches in Idaho history. Within 48 hours, more than 200 people had descended on Clearwater Ridge: Forest Service personnel, county sheriff deputies, state police, volunteer search and rescue teams, and bloodhounds that circled the station endlessly, whining with confusion because the scent trails simply stopped. Special Agent Frank Morrison of the FBI arrived on November 3rd. He was a methodical man in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of patience that came from 30 years of solving puzzles that didn't want to be solved. Morrison had worked missing persons cases across the Pacific Northwest, and he'd seen strange things: cults in the Oregon woods, survivalists who'd vanished into the mountains, cases where people walked away from their lives for reasons that made sense only to them. But this was different. This bothered him in ways he couldn't articulate. The evidence was contradictory. The Rangers had clearly left in a hurry: the warm coffee, the unlocked doors, the abandoned vehicles. But they'd left behind everything they'd need to survive in the wilderness: winter gear, food supplies, first aid kits, weapons. James Holloway's rifle was still mounted above his bed. Marcus Webb's medical bag sat on the kitchen counter, fully stocked. These were experienced Rangers who knew you didn't go into the Idaho wilderness in late October without preparation. And then, there were the things that made no sense at all. All 5 Rangers' beds had been slept in that night. The sheets were rumpled, the pillows still held the indentation of heads. But Trish Chen's glasses were missing. She was severely nearsighted. Without them, she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Why would she leave without her glasses? David Kowalski's St. Christopher medal lay on his bunk, the chain broken as if it had been torn off. David never took that medal off. Never. In the station's logbook, the last entry was in James Holloway's precise handwriting, dated October 29th, 10:15 p.m. All secure. No unusual activity. Weather holding. But witnesses would later testify that James had made his radio call at 9:47 p.m., 30 minutes earlier. What had happened in those 30 minutes? Morrison had interviewed everyone who'd had contact with the Rangers in their final days. The headquarters dispatcher who'd taken James's call about the bunker, the supply truck driver who'd delivered food 2 weeks earlier, a hunter who'd seen Marcus on patrol on October 27th and said he'd seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. But it was Trish's father, Henry Chen, who provided the detail that made Morrison's blood run cold. Henry had called his daughter on October 28th, the day before she vanished. He'd kept the call brief. Trish didn't like long phone conversations. But he'd asked her how she was doing, and she'd said something strange. "She told me they'd found something in the woods," Henry said, his hands shaking as he sat across from Morrison in the temporary command post. "She said it was old, from the Cold War maybe, and that it scared her. She said—" His voice broke. "She said she had a bad feeling about it, that they should leave it alone." Morrison had leaned forward. "Did she say what it was?" "A bunker. An underground bunker. She said Bobby wanted to go inside, but James had refused. She said Bobby had been acting strange, obsessed with it." Bobby Garrett. Morrison had pulled Garrett's personnel file, and what he'd found hadn't been reassuring. The transfer from Oregon had indeed followed an incident, a confrontation with a female hiker who'd accused Bobby of following her for miles, watching her camp. The charges had been dropped when the hiker suddenly refused to testify, but the file contained a psychiatric evaluation that recommended continued monitoring and noted difficulty with boundaries and authority. The search teams had found the bunker on November 5th, following the coordinates from James's radio call and the flagging tape the Rangers had left. When Morrison first saw it, covered in leaves and rust, he'd felt something shift in his gut. The instinct that told him he was looking at the answer, even if he didn't understand the question yet. They'd brought in equipment, lights, safety gear. A team of 6 went down: Morrison, 2 FBI agents, a Forest Service supervisor, and 2 county sheriff's deputies. The latter descended 20 feet into a concrete chamber that stretched out into darkness, cold and still as a tomb. The bunker was old, exactly as James had suspected, built sometime in the late 1940s or early 1950s, designed as a Cold War emergency shelter. The walls were thick concrete, the ceiling reinforced with steel beams. There were rooms, a command center with dead radio equipment, sleeping quarters with metal bunks, a storage area that had once held supplies now long expired and covered in mold. But there were other things too. Strange things. The walls were covered in writing, not graffiti but something more organized. Mathematical equations, chemical formulas, diagrams that looked like circuit boards or neural networks, drawn with obsessive precision. In one room they found filing cabinets filled with papers, most too water-damaged to read, but some intact enough to reveal fragments. Project Clearwater, behavioral modification, sensory deprivation, words that suggested experiments, tests, things that happened in this bunker decades ago. And then there were the cages. In the deepest room, they found them, 6 metal cages, each about 6 feet by 6 feet, with heavy locks and reinforced bars. The kind of cages you'd keep animals in. Or people. The concrete floor around them was stained with something dark that might have been rust or might have been something worse. Morrison had stood in that room, his flashlight beam cutting through the dust, and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with temperature. What had happened here? What had this place been used for? But the most disturbing discovery was the freshest one. Boot prints in the dust. Recent boot prints. Weeks old, maybe. Leading from the ladder, through the bunker, to the cages, and then disappearing. As if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist in that room. They searched every inch of the bunker. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, forensic teams. They found nothing. No bodies. No blood. No sign that the 5 Rangers had ever been there. The case consumed Morrison for months. He interviewed over 300 people. He investigated the bunker's history and discovered it had been built by a classified military program, details sealed under national security. He followed every lead, every rumor, every whispered theory. Nothing. By spring of 1980, the official search was scaled back. By summer, it was effectively over. The case remained open, but inactive. 5 people had vanished without a trace, and the forest had swallowed them whole. The families never stopped looking. Henry Chen spent his life savings hiring private investigators, psychics, anyone who claimed they could find his daughter. David Kowalski's fiancée Sarah visited Clearwater Ridge every year on the anniversary, walking the trails, calling his name into the silent woods. James Holloway's ex-wife told reporters she knew in her bones that he was dead, but she needed to bury him, needed that closure. They never got it. The bunker was sealed in 1981, welded shut by government order. The area was declared off-limits. Clearwater Ridge Wilderness Station was permanently closed, left to rot in the forest. Over the years, it became a local legend, the station where the rangers vanished, the haunted woods where 5 people walked into darkness and never walked out. Time passed. The world moved on. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. A new century approached, and the mystery of the 5 rangers became just another unsolved case, filed away in dusty archives, remembered only by those who'd lost someone they loved. Until October 1999. 20 years, almost to the day. A team of environmental researchers from the University of Idaho had been granted permission to survey the old-growth forest around Clearwater Ridge, studying climate change impacts on wilderness ecosystems. They weren't looking for the bunker. Most of them had never even heard the story of the missing rangers. They were just doing their job, taking soil samples, documenting tree growth, mapping the terrain with new GPS technology. It was a graduate student named Rachel Torres who found it. She'd been working in the northern sector, off the old trails, when her ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly, a large void beneath the earth, too regular to be a natural cave. Curious, she'd investigated and found it. Another hatch, 50 yards from the first bunker, so well hidden beneath decades of growth that no one had ever noticed it. This hatch wasn't rusted. It was newer, or at least better maintained. And when Rachel tried the handle, heart pounding with the excitement she didn't fully understand, it opened. The smell that rolled out made her gag. Stale air, yes. But underneath it, something else, something chemical and organic and wrong. She'd called her supervisor, who'd called the Forest Service, who'd called the county sheriff, who'd called Frank Morrison. Morrison was 79 years old now, officially retired for 15 years, living in a small house in Boise where he tended a garden and tried not to think about all the cases he'd never solved. When he got the call, something in his chest tightened. He knew, the way you know things in your bones, that this was it. This was the answer. He drove to Clearwater Ridge for the first time in 18 years. The forest looked the same, eternal and indifferent. The old station stood empty, windows broken, roof sagging, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But the bunker, the new bunker, that was something else entirely. They went down at dawn on October 31st, 1999, Halloween, 20 years to the day since the Rangers had disappeared. Morrison insisted on being part of the team despite his age, despite the doctors who told him his heart wasn't what it used to be. He needed to see. He needed to know. This bunker was different from the first. Deeper, for one thing. The ladder went down 40 feet instead of 20. And it was more complex, a maze of corridors and rooms that branched off in multiple directions. The walls were cleaner, the equipment more modern. This wasn't a Cold War relic. This was something that had been used more recently, much more recently. They found the command center first, a room filled with computers from the late 70s, early 80s, monitors with dark screens, keyboards covered in dust, filing cabinets with locks still engaged. On one desk, they found a calendar. October 1979. Someone had circled October 29th with red marker. Beneath the circle, in handwriting that was cramped and manic, final phase initiated. They found the sleeping quarters, 6 beds, neatly made, with personal items on the nightstands. A book, reading glasses, a photograph of a family, signs that people had lived here, worked here, existed in this underground tomb. And then they found the laboratory. It was the largest room in the bunker, filled with equipment that Morrison didn't fully understand. Electron microscopes, centrifuges, machines whose purpose he could only guess at. The walls were lined with shelves holding thousands of files, organized with obsessive precision. Experiment logs, subject reports, observation notes spanning decades, and photographs. Hundreds of photographs pinned to a corkboard. People's faces, most of them looking directly at the camera with expressions that ranged from confusion to terror. Morrison recognized some of the faces from missing persons cases he'd worked over the years. People who'd vanished in the wilderness. Hikers, campers, hunters who'd gone into the woods and never come out. But it was the 5 photographs in the center of the board that made his hands start shaking. James Holloway, Patricia Chen, Marcus Webb, David Kowalski, Robert Garrett. Their Ranger ID photos, with dates written beneath in that same cramped handwriting. Acquired, October 29th, 1979. Not missing, not lost, acquired. Morrison's team spent 3 days documenting everything in that bunker. They found files that detailed psychological experiments conducted on unwitting subjects, research into sensory deprivation, behavioral modification, something called deep conditioning, that involved keeping people underground for extended periods while exposing them to various stimuli. The files referenced a classified government program called Project Clearwater, the same name Morrison had seen 20 years earlier, a program that had apparently continued long after the official records claimed it had ended. They found evidence that the bunker had been occupied as recently as 1995. Someone had been down here, maintaining the equipment, continuing the work, long after the Cold War was over. But they didn't find the Rangers. Not yet. It was on the 4th day, in the deepest part of the bunker, that they found the sealed door. Heavy steel, with a wheel lock like a bank vault, and a warning stenciled in faded red paint. Authorized personnel only, extreme caution required. Morrison had stood before that door for a long moment, his old heart hammering against his ribs. Whatever answers lay behind it, he knew they wouldn't be the ones the families wanted. The truth rarely was. He reached for the wheel, began to turn it, and heard the mechanism inside clunk and grind after decades of disuse. The door swung open on hinges that screamed like wounded animals, and behind it, in a room lit by emergency lights that still glowed after 20 years, Frank Morrison found the truth about the 5 Rangers who went missing in 1979. He found what had been done to them. He found why they could never come home. October 31st, 1999. The room beyond the steel door was circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with walls made of thick glass panels that reflected the emergency lights in sickly green ripples. The temperature was wrong. Too warm, artificially maintained by humming machinery that lined the ceiling. The air tasted metallic, chemical, like breathing in the aftermath of a thunderstorm mixed with something pharmaceutical. Frank Morrison stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, and immediately understood why this room had been sealed, why it had been hidden even from the people who'd worked in the rest of the bunker. Some secrets are too terrible to be shared, even among conspirators. The center of the room held 5 cylindrical tanks, each about 7 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, arranged in a perfect circle. They were made of reinforced glass or acrylic, filled with a translucent amber fluid that seemed to glow from within. And suspended in each tank, connected to tubes and wires and monitoring equipment that still blinked with patient electronic life, were human bodies. Morrison's knees went weak. Behind him, one of the FBI agents vomited. The bodies were perfectly preserved, not decomposed, not mummified, but suspended in some kind of chemical stasis. Their skin was pale, almost luminescent, their hair floating gently in the fluid like underwater plants. Their eyes were closed, their faces slack, as if they were merely sleeping, waiting to wake. Morrison forced himself to move closer, to look at the face of the body in the first tank. Even after 20 years, even through the distortion of glass and fluid, he recognized the weathered features, the military short gray hair. James Holloway. The next tank held Patricia Chen, her black braid drifting around her shoulders, Her small frame curled slightly as if trying to make herself smaller. Then Marcus Webb, that scar on his forehead visible even through the amber liquid. David Kowalski, red hair darkened by the fluid, that spray of freckles across his nose. And finally, Robert Garrett, his thin face peaceful in a way it never had been in life. "Jesus Christ," Morrison whispered. "They've been here the whole time." The forensic team moved in with cameras, documentation equipment, medical scanners. The coroner, a woman named Dr. Susan Park, who'd seen more death than anyone should have to, examined the tanks with professional detachment that couldn't quite hide her horror. "The fluid is a preservative," she said, her voice tight. "Some kind of advanced cryogenic suspension medium. Their vital signs are—" She paused, checking monitors that were still recording data after 2 decades. "Minimal. Heart rate approximately 2 beats per minute. Brain activity present but suppressed. Metabolic function almost completely paused." "Are they alive?" Morrison asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. "Define alive," Dr. Park said quietly. "They're not dead, but they're not here either. It's like they're suspended between states, locked in some kind of deep hibernation." Morrison turned to the walls, looking for answers. One entire section was covered in charts and graphs, medical monitoring data stretching back 20 years, documenting every heartbeat, every brainwave, every metabolic function of the 5 bodies in these tanks. Another wall held a massive corkboard covered in documents, notes, photographs, all connected by red string and patterns that suggested obsession, methodology, madness. At the center of it all was a file marked Project Clearwater, Phase 4, Final Subjects. Morrison pulled it down, his hands shaking, and began to read. The truth unfolded in clinical language that made it somehow more horrifying. Project Clearwater had begun in 1947, shortly after World War II, when the U.S. government had become interested in Soviet research into psychological conditioning and behavioral modification. The program had been designed to study human consciousness, specifically whether it could be preserved, transferred, manipulated. The bunker at Clearwater Ridge had been one of several experimental sites, chosen for its isolation and the strange properties of the surrounding forest. High concentrations of quartz in the geology that created unusual electromagnetic patterns, making it ideal for certain types of sensory experiments. The early phases had involved volunteers from the military, then prisoners who'd been promised reduced sentences. But by the 1960s, the program had evolved. Subjects were no longer willing participants. They were people who wouldn't be missed, transients, hitchhikers, lone campers who'd ventured too far into the wilderness. The experiments had become more extreme, sensory deprivation lasting months, chemical treatments designed to break down personality barriers, attempts to map human consciousness so completely that it could theoretically be extracted, stored, replicated. Most subjects had died. Some had gone insane. A few had simply disappeared in ways that the files described, but that Morrison couldn't fully comprehend. Something about consciousness fragmenting, dissolving into the electromagnetic fields around the bunker, becoming part of the forest itself. The program should have ended in 1973, when congressional investigations into CIA abuses had shut down similar projects across the country. But Project Clearwater had continued, hidden under layers of classification, funded through black budgets that no one audited, run by a small group of scientists who believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough. By 1979, they'd perfected the suspension technology, the ability to keep a human body alive indefinitely while the consciousness was elsewhere, stored in the quantum patterns of the electromagnetic field, preserved in the very geology of the mountain, waiting to be retrieved. They needed final test subjects, people with outdoor experience, people who knew the forest, people who could be studied in their native environment before being taken underground. The rangers at Clearwater Ridge Station were perfect. It had been Bobby Garrett who'd made first contact. The files made that clear. Bobby, with his troubled history and his obsessions, had been recruited months earlier, turned into an asset, promised things the notes didn't specify. He'd been the one to create the signs in the clearing, to make the strange radio calls, to lead the other rangers to discover the bunker. All of it carefully orchestrated. On the night of October 29, 1979, Bobby had drugged the evening coffee. A fast-acting sedative that would leave the others confused, compliant, easy to manage. Then he'd convince them, or force them, to return to the bunker. He'd opened the second hatch, the one that led to this deep facility, and brought them down one by one. The scientists had been waiting. They'd processed the rangers quickly, efficiently, like specimens being prepared for storage. Medical examinations, psychological baselines, then the suspension tanks, the fluid, the slow descent into artificial hibernation. The plan, according to the files, was to keep them suspended for 6 months while their consciousness was mapped and studied. Then they'd be revived, with no memory of what had happened, and released back into the world. A perfect experiment with minimal risk of exposure. But something had gone wrong. Morrison found the final entry in the log, dated November 15, 1979, written in handwriting that had deteriorated from precise scientific notation to barely legible scrawl. Electromagnetic cascade event during consciousness mapping. Subjects' neural patterns have become entangled with the local field structure. Attempts to reverse the process have failed. Subjects cannot be safely revived without risking permanent psychological fragmentation. Dr. Voss has ordered the facility abandoned. Power to suspension systems will be maintained remotely, but all other operations cease immediately. This project is terminated. May God forgive us for what we've done. They'd left them. The scientists had simply sealed the door, walked away, and left 5 people suspended in tanks, their consciousness scattered across the electromagnetic field of the mountain, neither alive nor dead, trapped in a nightmare that had lasted 20 years. Morrison looked at the tanks again, at the faces floating in amber light, and felt something break inside him. He'd spent 20 years searching for these people, 20 years chasing ghosts. And now he'd found them, but there was no rescue, no reunion, no justice that would ever be enough. "Can they be revived?" he asked Dr. Park, though he already knew the answer. She was staring at the monitoring equipment, at readings that showed brain activity so fractured and dispersed it barely registered as human anymore. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The technology here is beyond anything I've seen." "Even if we could safely drain the tanks, there's no guarantee their consciousness would return to their bodies. According to these notes, they're distributed, spread across some kind of quantum field that exists in the geology of this mountain. Their bodies are here, but their minds are—" She gestured helplessly at the walls, the ceiling, the mountain above them. Everywhere and nowhere. "We have to try," Morrison said. They did try. Over the following weeks, the best medical minds in the country were brought in, sworn to secrecy, briefed on Project Clearwater and its horrific legacy. They studied the suspension system, the electromagnetic equipment, the detailed notes left by scientists who'd prioritized scientific advancement over human dignity. The decision was made to attempt revival on December 15, 1999. It would be the last major news story before the millennium, though most of the details would be suppressed, classified, buried under national security orders. They started with David Kowalski, the youngest, the one whose medical readings suggested he might have the best chance. They drained the tank slowly, carefully, keeping his body temperature regulated. They administered stimulants, used defibrillators to jumpstart his heart to a normal rhythm. They monitored his brain activity, watching for signs of consciousness returning. His eyes opened, his heart rate increased, his lungs began to draw breath on their own. But behind his eyes was nothing, no recognition, no awareness, no David. His body was alive, functional, moving through reflexive responses. But whatever had made him David Kowalski, his memories, his personality, his hope of proposing to Sarah at Christmas, was gone. scattered. Lost in the electromagnetic ghosts of a mountain that had claimed him 20 years ago. They tried with Marcus Webb 3 days later. The result was the same. A living body, an empty mind, a shell that breathed and blinked but couldn't recognize its own reflection. They didn't try with the others. The families were told finally after 20 years of waiting. They were told their loved ones had been found, that they'd been the victims of illegal government experimentation, that they were technically alive but could never come home. Not really. Not as the people they'd been. Henry Chen collapsed when he heard. Sarah withdrew the wedding ring she'd kept in a lockbox for 20 years and threw it into a river. James Holloway's ex-wife just nodded, as if she'd always known it would end this way. The bodies were placed in a secure medical facility, cared for by staff who treated them with the dignity they deserved but couldn't acknowledge. David and Marcus lived for another 6 months before their bodies simply stopped. As if whatever had been holding them together finally gave up. The other 3 remained in their tanks, still suspended, still somewhere between life and death. Project Clearwater became Project Mercy, a quiet government program dedicated to keeping them comfortable, waiting for medical advances that might someday bring them back. As of 2024, they're still there, still waiting. Bobby Garrett's body was never found. Some of the files suggested he'd volunteered for a different kind of experiment, something to do with full consciousness transfer, becoming one with the electromagnetic field. Others hinted he'd simply walked into the forest after bringing the Rangers underground, disappeared into the wilderness he'd pretended to love. Hikers in the Clearwater Ridge area still report strange things. Voices in the woods that sound like 5 people talking in unison. Shadows that move wrong. A sense of being watched by something that isn't quite human anymore. Rangers, new Rangers, assigned to other stations, avoid the area, claiming the forest feels wrong there, like a place where reality is thinner than it should be. Frank Morrison died in 2002, 3 years after finding the bunker. His last words, according to his hospice nurse, were, "I found them, but I couldn't bring them home." The Clearwater Ridge Wilderness Station still stands, slowly rotting back into the earth. The bunkers were filled with concrete, sealed, marked with warnings that will outlast anyone who remembers what happened there. But sometimes, on October nights when the rain comes down in sheets and the forest grows quiet with that oppressive, suffocating silence, people claim to see lights in the station windows. 5 lights, moving from room to room, as if 5 people are still living there, still doing their jobs, still waiting for a rescue that will never come. Because some disappearances aren't really disappearances at all. Sometimes people don't leave. They're taken, changed, scattered across electromagnetic fields in a mountain that refuses to let them go. Sometimes the missing are still there, trapped between states of being, neither alive enough to return nor dead enough to rest. And sometimes the only truth you find is one that offers no comfort, no closure, no justice. Just the cold knowledge that some experiments should never have been conducted, some doors should never have been opened, and some secrets should have stayed buried in bunkers beneath the earth, where the darkness could hide the terrible things we do to each other in the name of progress. 5 Rangers went missing in 1979. 20 years later, a hidden bunker revealed the truth. But truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it just shows you that freedom was never really an option at all.